Why would any parent subject their child to this?
It's devastating, right? It's microcephaly, it's cataracts, it's horrific heart disease and pneumonitis. I've taken care of kids with pertussis. It's called whooping cough because the Bordetella pertussis bacterium literally destroys the airways with a toxin, and the child, in desperation to catch some oxygen, gives a big whoop of inspiration. I've taken care of kids intubated with measles. I've held the hand of parents who've watched their child die of Hib meningitis.
But this is where we are heading under the Trump regime, an anti-public health, anti-science administration, according to Lawrence Gostin, a global health law professor at Georgetown Law School. Gostin told Time magazine, quote, "To say that RFK Jr. is unqualified is a considerable understatement." He went on to say the minimum qualification for being the head of the Department of Health and Human Services is fidelity to science and scientific evidence. And he spent his entire career fomenting distrust in public health and undermining science at every step of the way.
Case. Polio really erupted in 1916 in Brooklyn with a lot of cases, but then it took off again when remember FDR got polio in 1921, and that spurred the first effort to really develop a vaccine. Some of us may remember the March of Dimes, where everybody gave a dime to develop a polio vaccine. Coincidentally, you had a huge spike in polio in the 1940s. In 1955, the polio vaccine was licensed. I want to inject a personal note here. I was one of the first cohorts of people to get injected, and I remember well how excited and relieved my parents were that their kids were not going to have to worry about polio. And polio, lo and behold, dropped to 0 cases today. And the red line here are the deaths, of which there were a significant number. You guys mentioned COVID and Operation Warp Speed, an amazing accomplishment, a vaccine developed in less than a year. And we have really good data comparing people who got the vaccine to people who didn't get the vaccine. And you can see the weekly death rate. This is the Omicron surge, which we all remember all too well, unfortunately. This is the death rate for people who did not get the vaccine. This is the death rate way down here for the people who did get the vaccine. And for people who got the booster, an even lower death rate.
Hi, my name is Suri Crowe, and you are watching the MeidasTouch Network. All right, let's get into it. That crazy thing called science. Well, data shows that vaccines actually do work. If Trump gets vaccine denier, because he's not a skeptic, he's an outright denier, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., confirmed as a head of Health and Human Services, we are in for some dangerous times. This is the man who shot up heroin for 15 years and swears it helped him academically.
At the bottom of my class, I started doing heroin. I went to the top of my class. Suddenly I could sit still and I could read.
So he's a heroin addict or former heroin addict, but he denies the science behind vaccines. Okay, and remember the Trump COVID nightmare? Well, thanks to Trump's intentional mismanagement of the pandemic, it's estimated that 220,000 people died unnecessarily. And that is a conservative estimate, according to the National Institute of Health. With RFK Jr. at the helm of HHS, we could see the resurgence of mumps, measles, and rubella. That is just to name a few of the childhood diseases and illnesses that are totally preventable by vaccine. Dr. Paul Offit, director of the Vaccine Education Center at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, a renowned children's hospital, by the way, has served on CDC and FDA vaccine advisory committees, says he was, quote, sickened by the news of Kennedy being nominated for this position. He compares Kennedy being considered for the role to, quote, having somebody who doesn't believe in gravity being the head of NASA. Ouch. And here is Dr. Paul Offit on CNN.
Tommy Tuberville said they discussed how they grew up in a generation where they received just 3 vaccines. He talked about tuberculosis, smallpox, polio, and noting how that has now grown to the dozens. And the way Tuberville talked about it to CNN is that he says that he wants parents to understand the good, the bad, and the ugly with vaccines rather than forcing parents to give them to kids. What do you hear in that?
So Tommy Tuberville said, look, RFK Jr. and I only got 3 vaccines and we're both fine. That's called survivor bias. I mean, the notion is that we were fine, so therefore everybody else is fine. This thing about transparency is very upsetting to me because you can see all the data that everybody else sees. It's all open to the public. I mean, when we, the FDA Vaccine Advisory Committee, reviewed, for example, the COVID vaccines in December of 2020. We reviewed about 800 pages of data. That was all on FDA's website for anybody to look at. I don't know what Tommy Tuberville is talking about, but one thing that Tommy Tuberville said that should be a key to exactly what RFK Jr. is going to do is he said, I just talked to RFK Jr. And we talked about how do we really need all these vaccines? That tells you everything about what RFK Jr. is about to do. He is about to do everything he can to destroy the vaccine program in this country. And I think it is a dangerous time to be a child in the United States of America.
It makes me so sad to hear you say that. Your entire career is based on trying to protect children of America. And again, it sounds like, listen to what RFK is saying. He's telling you what he's going to do.
The Trump regime is literally going to send us into third world country status. We're not going to be great at all. We're going back to the medieval ages. Instead of being the nation that has led health and safety around the globe, we are now going to be known for resurrecting childhood diseases like polio.
What would it be like if the polio vaccine was no longer available?
John, this is a very fragile vaccine ecosystem. It doesn't take much for these diseases to come back, and you've got to maintain constant vigilance. So the case, for instance, of the measles, the polio case that we had in a 20-year-old individual a couple of years ago who wasn't vaccinated, that could happen very easily. And so all of these could look like they're on their way up and coming back fairly quickly. And we're not being out there enough really countering the anti-vaccine rhetoric.
Now, there are guardrails that would prevent Kennedy from banning vaccines outright, but scientists are worried that his position would influence state and local officials and sow public distrust, just like Trump himself did with COVID, even though, as Modern Man pointed out in this truthful post, quote, America's Hitler nearly died of COVID, but got the world's best care while telling MAGA that it was a hoax, don't trust the vaccine, take fish tank cleaner, horse pills, bleach, and don't wear masks. We can officially add mass manslaughter to his rap sheet. Well, he's not far off because Republicans died at almost twice the rate that Democrats did, and that is according to studies. And if you look at Dr. Neil Stone here, he is posting data about the COVID vaccine, which he says was a massive success during the pandemic. Look at how global deaths plummeted. He says once the vaccines were rolled out at scale in early 2022. And that is exactly right. When President Biden took office, his administration rolled out vaccines at scale, made them accessible to everyone, if you recall, went from being damn near impossible to get a vaccine to everyone could get one. And as a result, COVID deaths plummeted. And that is what eventually resulted in President Biden being able to call an end to the pandemic as we knew it because of science. Voila! It's not magic, people. It's called evidence-based science. But Republicans continue to push out disinformation like Marge Green, who has absolutely no scientific background at all. In fact, I'm not even sure she has a college degree, but she, quote, fully believes that vaccines cause autism. This is disinformation. There is no evidence at all that this is true. It has been disproven again and again that vaccines do not cause autism, but what they do prevent are childhood diseases and deaths.
Peter Hotez, he is the co-director of the Center for Vaccine Development at Texas Children's Hospital and author of The Deadly Rise of Anti-Science, A Scientist's Warning. Dr. Hotez, great to see you again. So what goes through your mind? What goes through your mind when you hear that someone involved with staffing HHS has called for the government to revoke the polio vaccine's approval?
Well, here's the big worry, John. This kind of anti-vaccine rhetoric is part of a larger coordinated disinformation campaign. And the consequences we're now seeing. We've had not only an increase in measles outbreaks, as was just reported, from 4 to 16 from 2023 to 2024. We've had a 5-fold rise in pertussis, otherwise known as whooping cough. And now there's polio that's been reported in the wastewater in New York State in 2022. And as I'm not only, we've been talking about COVID vaccines for years now. I not only make vaccines, but I'm also a pediatrician, and I've taken care of children with congenital rubella syndrome. So the MMR, the R part stands for rubella. It's devastating, right? It's microcephaly, it's cataracts, it's horrific heart disease and pneumonitis. I've taken care of kids with pertussis. It's called whooping cough because the Bordetella pertussis bacterium literally destroys the airways with a toxin, and the child, in desperation to catch some oxygen, gives a big whoop of inspiration. I've taken care of kids intubated with measles. I've held the hand of parents who've watched their child die of Hib meningitis. All of that's going to coming back because of this kind of anti-vaccine rhetoric and activism. And that's why it's important to speak out and really push back on this. John, this is a very fragile vaccine ecosystem. It doesn't take much for these diseases to come back. And you've got to maintain constant vigilance. So the case, for instance, of the measles, the polio case that we had in a 20-year-old individual a couple of years ago who wasn't vaccinated, that could happen very easily. And so all of these could look like they're on their way up and coming back fairly quickly. And we're not being out there enough really countering the anti-vaccine rhetoric. And there is no relationship with any of these vaccines and autism.
Trump proved in his first term that his policies are dangerous for public health. And that fits in with autocracy and what Vladimir Putin wants for America, for us to implode and destroy from within. As Yale scholar and author Timothy Snyder wrote on a recent Substack, one weakness of democracy in the United States has always been public health. The lack of a national healthcare system brings us shorter lives, greater anxiety, and less freedom. Now with RFK Jr., we face the rollback of vaccinations and thus a return precisely of mumps and rubella and measles, which are halted by the same vaccine, and much else. The rest of the oligarchical cabinet will weaken government by law through incompetence, spite, or avarice. But RFK Jr. will break society by making us sick. It's one thing if people knowingly choose to ignore science and data. It's another when at-risk communities like children and communities of color who don't have access to this information or who are influenced by people that they trust, who mislead them. Irresponsible government officials like RFK Jr. and some of these others who right now are denying vaccine science. People will die as a result of that. It is so irresponsible and dangerous. My name is Suri Crowe. Thank you so much for watching. I just want to dedicate this particular episode to my dad, a pediatric surgeon who dedicated and devoted his entire life to saving the lives of children and to medical science. And he would just be horrified by what is going on right now with the Trump regime. Please share this video, and you can find me and follow me on Blue Sky and TikTok while it's still around, and most often on Instagram. Peace.
Hey Midas Mighty, love this report? Continue the conversation by following us on Instagram at MeidasTouch to keep up with the most important news of the day. What are you waiting for? Follow us now.